Hello, this week is an introduction to the course content. Last week we looked at the course outline. This week we're looking at an introduction to healthy rural and small town communities. And as mentioned previously, my name is Wayne Caldwell. And with that I bring my experience as a practicing planner for many years, as a consultant as well, and certainly here at academia for a period of time now. And a real interest in this topic because it relates to people in their lives, the things that they do on a day-to-day basis. And when we think of healthy and rural small town communities, in many ways, that's what exists at the heart of it. It's trying to make things better for people and the communities within which they live. This week, there's a number of materials that you'll want to have a look at, again identified on the course link website. And there's a listing of videos and readings, and the assignments are identified within the course outline. And this week we'll look at this introduction, which I've mentioned. We'll talk about what is a healthy rural and small town community. We'll look at the context that it fits within this course. We'll look at some of the planning perspectives that take us back historically, because I think it's important. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's important to realize that this is a topic that's been with the planning profession for more than 100 years in its own way. Key determinants of health was mentioned last week, and as you introduce yourselves to assignment 1, really important that you spend some time looking at that content. There's a reading attached to the key determinants of health, and 2 or 3 other links there. Have a look at the Planning by Design document, a Healthy Community Handbook, the Healthy Rural Communities Toolkit, which I mentioned last week, and of course the website with the Healthy Rural Communities materials on it that you'll find to be helpful too. So that's just to get you set for what we'll be looking at this week. So the initial question is, why a rural and small town perspective, which is to say, how do we plan, build, and service communities impacts health? If we do that well, it has a positive outcome. If we do it not so well, there's a risk of it having a negative outcome. And of course, there's a specific interest and a specific need and context with rural communities. If we think about people you might know that live within rural areas, most probably have automobiles, limited opportunity to walk. They're forced to use a personal car. Of course, it's also to recognize that the built environment is associated with many diseases and illnesses, all the way from diabetes to heart disease to respiratory diseases and so on. Other health indices in rural communities, higher incidences of smoking, higher incidences of drinking, things of that nature, which brings a perspective to look at this topic as well. A little quote right at the bottom of that slide, reflecting on your reading of the Healthy Rural Communities Toolkit. Why should there be a focus on healthy rural communities? With that question in mind, why should there be a focus on healthy rural communities? Look at some of these following slides. And you'll see on the slide deck, there's a series of photos which are presenting themselves. And I invite you to look at those photos and see what impressions you are having. What are some of the things that you're noticing in this rural context? And for me, there's pictures there that capture a whole lot of things. And there's no right or wrong answers to this. But it's simply to say there's things happening in the rural community. We see a barn which is falling down there, the changing, the restructuring which has been going on in rural Ontario. We see an example in my top left, it's also your top left here as well, of issues around sprawl that can sometimes happen in rural communities. And what does it mean to live in a community which is of nature such as the one that we're seeing here? The importance of infrastructure, there are community services, water quality issues, the role of transportation and community activities. All of those are things that are going on within rural communities that bring a rural perspective and the need for a rural perspective to this topic. This next slide, you will see some different impressions, different visions that touch upon things such as, and again, I invite you to think about what your answer to this question would be. But we see things such as the importance of a downtown. To remember that we share the spaces within which we live with other species as well. The role of elderly within our community, and we'll talk later about an age-friendly approach to planning. We see youth and the role that youth play. And I can't help but emphasize the importance of agriculture in many rural communities, and at least in southwestern Ontario and eastern Ontario as well, the role of local food and so on. All of these items are examples of the things that you will see on a day-to-day basis in rural communities. And again, it's this need to look at these topics with a rural lens, with a rural perspective, recognizing there's some important differences that we'll look at in time. I hate to put up a slide with lots of words on it, but I will because there are two important definitions here, one of which is rural planning, which from my perspective essentially is to say that when we do rural planning, we're planning for rural areas with a rural lens and with a rural perspective, focusing on rural issues. And it's to say that those issues are sometimes different in rural communities than they are in urban communities, and we need to be thinking about those from a planning perspective. Healthy and rural and small town communities, definition that I have generated for the purpose of this course. I've done many things with healthy communities, and I look back through them and realize I didn't have a definition of what was a healthy rural and small town community. So let's try this one on for size. Well, there are many definitions and perspectives. A healthy rural and small town community is cognizant of issues of sustainability, blending the economic, the social, and the environmental in a rural and small town context. Residents are able to pursue healthy, active lifestyles, access services, find meaningful employment, and enjoy a desired quality of life living in a healthy environment. And you can devise your own definition, but there's several things here that I think are important. It's that notion of sustainability, which is blending those key components of our economy, what do we do for a living, the spaces within which we live, and of course having appropriate social services and so on. And this notion of pursuing livelihoods, of pursuing community activities, reaching that and for that desired quality of life. This next slide that many of you will be familiar with in terms of the Brundtland Commission, in terms of looking at sustainability, again that blending of those three components. So sustainability ensures that development is economically feasible, reduces or prevents environmental degradation, and encourages stewardship, and promotes equality and fairness. And I think those are things that probably all of us aspire to within the communities within which we live. I'm going to try to slow down, folks, just a little bit because I have this tendency to go too quickly, so hopefully I know it's hard for you to remind me to slow down, but I'll do my best. So this notion of a broad definition of rural planning, I think, is also important. Sometimes, as planners, we might be tempted to say that rural planning is about the built environment and only the built environment, that we focus on land use, official plans, zoning bylaws, things of that nature. But I want to encourage us to be thinking more broadly than that within the context of this course. So certainly land use and design is core, but so too are topics such as community economic development, helping people to achieve the economic outcomes within their community that they might look for. Social planning, things like housing, that people have affordable and safe and secure homes. Resource planning, that we're thinking about what resources exist within the community in terms of natural resources. That ties into natural heritage planning as well. And there may be other components of rural planning that I think are important, all the way from architecture and the protection of heritage and values of that nature. So there are a number of topics there which you may choose to unpack individually within this course or within other courses that you might be taking. But the key thing is to say all of these perspectives in rural planning impact health outcomes in one way or the other. Coming back to that question, why rural, and I mentioned this in the first week, is that this particular graph, and again, you won't be able to see it on my screen, but there's a key message behind it, and it looks at a whole series of health indices from functional health through to injuries, through to overweight or obesity, diabetes and asthma. And what's interesting for these 10 or so indicators which are identified there is that rural folk living in rural communities consistently do not score as well as people living in urban communities. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but certainly one of them is the connection to the built environment that we will talk about as weeks proceed. And I often think of my own personal situation where I live on a farm, worked in the town of Goderich with the Kern County Planning Department for years. It was getting in the car, driving to work, and turning around and driving home again. Whereas in the context of being here at the University of Guelph, condo in downtown Guelph, I walk in back and forth as much as possible. And within my life, I can look at those two experiences, one which is abundantly rural and abundantly car dependent, and the other of which is urban, based in the city of Guelph, and the ability to walk from place to place is much, much greater. So as we proceed with this course, it's important to think, what is a rural and small town community? What does it mean in the context of this particular course and what we're doing? And I think there are various ways you can look at it. There are many definitions. I actually like the definition a student gave at a thesis defense yesterday, which was rural means that I don't have a Walmart. Maybe a bit of a humorous way of looking at it, but for many people, it's their own perspective on rural. And in the context of this course, generally we're thinking about smaller communities. Small cities, when I say small cities, I'm thinking of the Stratfords and the Orangevilles and maybe even the Guelphs of the world, but certainly that community size and smaller. Small towns and villages, and of course the rural spaces that connect those, that exist between those towns and villages, the expansive countryside that interacts with those urban settlements. So that's the kind of place we're thinking about. For many, virtually every municipality within the province of Ontario, in my view, will have areas which I would consider to be rural spaces. The City of Toronto, perhaps an exception. Even a city like Hamilton has huge rural areas attached to it. So too does a city like Chatham-Kent, which is a single-tier municipality as well. So keeping in mind it includes much of Ontario and elsewhere within the country as well. So how do today's interest in healthy communities connect with their past? This course is not about history in terms of the history of planning, but there are some important considerations. If we think back to the beginnings of planning both here and in Europe as well, there are strong connections to public health. Things such as water quality and the issue of septic effluent within municipalities that existed more than 100 years ago was a real driving force to organize their cities and spaces in a way that led to better health outcomes. Historically, there were issues of poverty that planning could help to address, as there were issues of land speculation as well. And if we look at some of the works by Thomas Adams, who is a noted, it's usually thought of in quotation marks, the father of Canadian planning, if you like, did lots of work looking at land speculation as it connected to rural development. In fact, the first planning book written in Canada was entitled Rural Planning and Development, and it encompassed many of these points in terms of health and poverty and land speculation and the way that it connects to rural development. Also connected to that, and as we move forward into the present time period, are the determinants of health. And basically I would define these as being those things which have a fundamental impact on the health that you and I, our parents, our grandparents, might have had in terms of how they fit within the community within which they lived and worked. There are readings connected to this, so I invite you to look at that in more detail. You can see that there's a listing from this particular source here of 12 determinants, and they range from income and social status. Quite clearly, if I have better income, I probably have access to better housing, access to better food, all of which tends to lead to a healthier outcome. We can look at things such as education and literacy. If there are opportunities for quality education, both of our youth and of people as they move through life, then again you tend to have better health outcomes. Just looking at another item there, the physical environment. Clearly the spaces within which we live and work in terms of their physical attributes, the built environment, but also the natural environment as well, can lead to healthier outcomes for us as citizens and residents of the communities. And of course, there are other things listed there, child development. Again, 12 items listed here, not going to go into them all in detail, but it's simply to say it's worth us thinking about these, particularly as we complete assignment number 1, because you'll want to reflect on some of this as you think about the health of the community within which you are writing about. There's also this diagram which is provided, and again, look to the content that's online in terms of this presentation to see the specificity of it with people in the center. And the reason I'm looking at the screen behind me is my little screen in front of me is too small, but it speaks to the importance of the natural environment, the built environment, and activities within the context of the economy and community within which they're located, all of which leads to an impact on the health that our residents enjoy. So the question is, how do they impact rural populations, these determinants of health, rural and small town communities, and what is the relationship to planning? And I invite you to reflect on that question because I think you'll immediately start to see some of the connections that exist. I also want to introduce you, and we'll look at this in more detail in subsequent weeks, but to OPPI's Planning by Design. This is the document on I guess it's on the right in the screen, It was a project that OPPI did. I was the president of the Ontario Professional Planners Institute at the time when this was released, or I was close to that role anyway, in the fall of 2009, done jointly with the province. And lots of practical content was in that will help you do some of the assignments, that will also help you in understanding this topic as we look more into the built environment. The other document, and I've had the opportunity to share this a number of times, which is the Healthy Rural Communities Toolkit. And within that, there are also a broad range of topics that we look at in terms of health outcomes. And this is my next to last slide for this group, but it's introduction to the website that we put together. And it includes the toolkit I just referred to. There's numerous interviews that we've completed and conducted, which are available under under more, which is video. There's actions that can be taken and so on. And this is a website which is designed to help people who are working in planning in rural communities to actually make a difference, to tackle some of the issues that they might be facing. So with that, just to introduce you to next week, we'll be looking at community design and land use planning. And you will have, in the meantime, been working on assignment number 1, which is beginning essentially this week and is due a week from now. And you'll want to look through the course outline for more details of how to pull that together. So thank you for joining me this week, and we'll look forward to next week's discussions.